Hey, guess what today is? Today was the day that hopefully our future president, Joe Biden, picked his running mate. Yeah. Do you know who it is? Kamala Harris. I mean, for real. How awesome. Well, I'm happy. There are some people not as enamored with the choice as I wish they would be. But that's okay. They'll come around. She's gonna eviscerate Pence, and it's gonna be epic. Actually, I don't know if epic's the right word. It's gonna be something to watch. But anyway, on to the next part of Chapter 9, The Art of the Bailout. I am only going to be able to read probably about 10 or 15 minutes today. Yeah, just about there. Yeah, so on we go. By some miracle, I had gotten into Tufts University after boarding school, and despite dropping out the second semester of my freshman year, I graduated in 1989, a year later, just before my grandfather's modest purchase of a $3.15 million worth of casino chips. I entered the graduate program in English and Comparative Literature at Columbia University. 2 months after the semester started, my apartment was burgled. All of my electronics, including my typewriter, which was essential for school, were taken. When I called Irwin to see if I could get an advance on my allowance, he refused. My grandfather thought I should get a job, he told me. The next time I visited my grandmother at the house, I explained the situation to her, and she offered to write me a check. It's okay, Gam. I only have to wait a couple of weeks. Mary, she said, never reject a gift of money. She wrote me the check, and I was able to buy a typewriter later that week. I soon got an angry call from Irwin. Did you ask your grandmother for money? Not exactly, I said. I told her I got robbed and she helped me out. While going through the canceled checks of all his personal and business accounts, as well as my grandmother's, as he did at the end of every month, my grandfather had discovered the check my grandmother had written to me, and he was furious. Oh, excuse me. You need to be careful, Irwin warned me. Your grandfather often speaks of disowning you. I got another call from Irwin a few weeks later. My grandfather was angry with me again, this time because he didn't like the signature with which I endorsed my checks. Irwin, you've got to be kidding. I'm not. He hates the fact that it's illegible. It's a signature. He paused and softened his tone. Change it, Mary. You've got to play the game. Your grandfather thinks you're being selfish, and there may be nothing left by the time you turn 30. But I never understood what he meant by the game. It was my family, not a bureaucracy. I don't see what I'm doing wrong. I'm getting a master's degree at an Ivy League university. He doesn't care. Does Donald know about this? Yes. He's my trustee. What does he have to say? Donald? Irwin laughed dismissively. Nothing. My grandfather hadn't yet been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, but he'd been struggling with dementia for a while by then, so I didn't take the threats too seriously. I did, however, change my signature. Everyone in my family experienced a strange combination of privilege and neglect. Although I had all of the material things I needed and luxuries such as private school and summer camp, there was a purposely built-in idea of uncertainty that any of it would last. By the same token, there was the sometimes dispiriting and sometimes devastating sense that nothing any of us did really mattered, or worse, that we didn't matter. Only Donald did. Trump management, which Donald often referred to as a two-bit operation, was doing fairly well. Fred paid himself more than $109 million between 1988 and 1993 and had tens of millions more in the bank. The Trump Organization, the company Donald ostensibly ran, was, however, in increasingly serious trouble. Reduced to a monthly allowance that a family of 4 could have lived on comfortably for 10 years, but still an allowance, and shut out by the banks, which finally refused to lend him more money, Donald fully believed that whatever was happening to him was the result of the economy, the poor treatment he received from the banks, and bad luck. Nothing was ever fair to him. That struck a chord with Fred, who nursed his own grievances and also never took responsibility for anything other than his successes. Donald's talent for deflecting responsibility while balancing his father's playbook. Donald's talent for deflecting responsibility while projecting blame onto others came straight from his father's playbook. Sorry about that, guys. Even with the untold millions of dollars Fred spent, he couldn't prevent Donald's failures, but he could certainly find a scapegoat, just as he had always done with his missteps and poor judgment caught up with him, as when he blamed Freddie for the failure of Steeplechase. Donald knew that taking responsibility for your failures, which obviously meant acknowledging failure, was not something Fred admired. He'd seen where it had gone Freddie. It's very possible that back in the late 1960s and 70s, Fred didn't know just how deep Donald's ineptitude ran. Acknowledging weakness of any kind in the son of whom he had staked the future of his empire and for whom he had sacrificed Freddie would have been nearly impossible. It was much easier to convince himself that Donald's talents were wasted in the backwaters of Brooklyn. He simply needed a bigger pond in which to make a splash. As the Commodore Hotel slowly transformed into the Grand Hyatt, Fred was so blinded by the success with which Donald manipulated and debased every part of the process in order to get his way that he seemed to forget how vital his own connections, knowledge, and skill were. Neither the Hyatt nor Trump Tower would have seen the light of day without them. I mean, for God's sakes, this woman's panache for run-on sentences. I need a second. It's an entire chapter full of run-on sentences so far. So I apologize for butchering this, guys, but oh my goodness. Okay, shall we continue? Even Fred's head must have been turned by all the attention Donald generated, for two projects, if developed by anybody else, would have been considered fairly commonplace occurrences in Manhattan. Fred had known all along what games Donald was playing because he'd taught Donald how to play them. Working the refs, lying, cheating, as far as Fred was concerned, those were all legitimate business tactics. The most effective game for both father and son was the shell game. While Fred kept turning out projects and solidifying his status as a post-war master builder, he was fattening his wallet with taxpayer money by skimming off the top and allegedly committing so much tax fraud that 4 of his children would continue to benefit from it for decades. While the rubes focused on the salacious details Donald kept generating for the tabloids, he was building a reputation for success based on bad loans, bad investments, and worse judgment. The difference between the two, however, is that despite his dishonesty and lack of integrity, Fred actually ran a solid income-generating business, while Donald had only his ability to spin and his father's money to prop up an illusion. Once Donald moved into Atlantic City, there was no longer any denying that he wasn't just ill-suited to the day-to-day grind of running a few dozen middle-class rental properties in the outer boroughs. He was ill-suited to running any kind of business at all, even one that ostensibly played to his strengths of self-promotion and self-aggrandizement and his taste for glitz. Okay, I'm going to show you this. Like, this entire paragraph right here, that's one sentence. One sentence. When Fred bragged about Donald's brilliance and claimed that his son's success had far outpaced his own, he must have known that not a word of it was true. He was too smart and too good at arithmetic to think otherwise. The numbers simply didn't add up. But the fact that Fred continued to prop Donald up despite the wisdom of continuing to do so suggests that something else was going on. Because Fred did deny the reality on the ground in Atlantic City, he had already shown himself impervious to facts that didn't fit his narrative, so he blamed the banks and the economy and the casino industry just as vociferously as his son did. Fred had become so invested in the fantasy of Donald's success that he and Donald were inextricably linked. Facing reality would have required acknowledging his own responsibility, which he would never do. He had gone all in, and although any rational person would have folded, Fred was determined to double down. There was still plenty of publicity to turn Fred's head, and thanks to the bank that the father and son maligned, the extraordinary financial reversal didn't put a dent in Donald's lifestyle. Finally, there was the slow-rolling toll that his as-yet undiagnosed Alzheimer was beginning to take on his executive functioning. Already susceptible to believing the best of his worst son, it became easier over time for him to confuse the hype about Donald with reality. As usual, The lesson Donald learned was the one that supported his pre-existing assumption. No matter what happened, no matter how much damage he leaves in his wake, he will be okay. Knowing ahead of time that you're going to be bailed out if you fail renders the narrative leading up to that moment meaningless. Claim that a failure is a tremendous victory, and the shameless grandiosity will retroactively make it so. That guaranteed that Donald would never change, even if he were capable of changing, because he simply didn't need to. It also guaranteed a cascade of increasingly consequential failures that would ultimately render all of us collateral damage. As the bankruptcies and embarrassments mounted, Donald was confronted for the first time with the limits of his ability to talk or threaten his way out of a problem. Always adept at finding an escape hatch, he seemed to have come up with a plan to betray his father and steal vast sums of money from his siblings. He secretly approached two of my grandfather's longest-serving employees, Erwin Durbin, his lawyer, and Jack Mitnick, his accountant, and enlisted them to draft a codicil to my grandfather's will that would put Donald in complete control of Fred's estate, including the empire and all its holdings after he died. Marianne, Elizabeth, and Robert would effectively be at Donald's financial mercy, dependent on his approval for the smallest transaction. As Gam later told Marianne, when Erwin and Jack went to the house to have Fred sign the codicil, they presented the document as if it had been Fred's idea all along. My grandfather, who was having one of his more lucid days, sensed something was not right, although he couldn't exactly say what. He angrily refused to sign. After Erwin and Jack left, Fred conveyed his concerns to his wife. My grandmother immediately called her oldest child to explain what had happened as best she could. In short, she said, it simply didn't pass the smell test. Marianne, with her background as a persecutor, had limited knowledge of trusts and estates. She asked her husband, John Barry, a well-known and respected attorney in New Jersey, to recommend someone who could help, and he asked one of his colleagues to look into the situation. It didn't take long for Donald's scheme to be uncovered. As a result, my grandfather's entire will was rewritten, replacing one he had written in 1984. And Marianne, Donald, and Robert were all named as executors. In addition, a new standard was put into place. Whatever Fred gave Donald, he would have to give an equal amount to each of the other 3 children. Marianne would say years later, we would have been penniless. Elizabeth would have been begging on a street corner. We would have had to beg Donald if we wanted a cup of coffee. It was sheer luck that they had stopped the scheme. Yet the siblings still got together every holiday as though nothing had happened. Donald's attempt to wrest control of Fred's estate away from him was the logical outcome of Fred's leading son to believe that he was the only person who mattered. Donald had been given more of everything. He had been invested in, elevated to the detriment of Marianne, Elizabeth, and Robert, and even his mother, and at the expense of Freddie. In Donald's mind, the success and reputation of the entire family rested on his shoulders. Given that, it made sense in the end that he would feel he deserved not just more than his fair share, but everything. I was standing at the window of my studio apartment looking at the rush hour traffic clogging the 59th Street Bridge when Donald called me from his plane. Not a usual occurrence. The dean of students at Tufts sent me a letter you wrote. Really? Why? It took me a minute to realize what he was talking about. One of my professors had been up for tenure, and before I graduated, I had written a letter in support of him. That had been 4 years earlier, and I'd forgotten all about it. The letter was to show me how great you thought Tufts was. It was a fundraising thing. I'm sorry, that was rude of him. No, it's a fantastic letter. The point of the conversation was eluding me. Then Donald said, apropos of nothing as far as I could tell, do you want to write my next book? The publisher wants me to get started, and I thought it would be a great opportunity for you. It'll be fun. That sounds incredible, I said, and it did. I heard the plane engine rev in the background and remembered where he was. Where are you going, anyway? Heading back from Vegas. Call Rona tomorrow. Rona Graff was his executive assistant at the Trump Organization. I will. Thanks, Donald. It wasn't until later, when I reread the letter, that I understood why Donald thought it would be a good idea for me to hire. Not because it was fantastic, but because it demonstrated that I was really good at making other people look really good. A few days later, I was given my own desk in the back office of the Trump Organization, a nondescript, open space with drop ceilings, fluorescent lighting, and huge steel filing cabinets lining the wall. It had a lot more in common with the utilitarian office of Trump management on Avenue Z than the gold and glass walls lined with magazine covers featuring Donald's face that greeted guests out front. I spent the first week on the job familiarizing myself with the people who worked there in the filing system. To my surprise, there was a folder with my name on it, containing a single sheet of paper, a handwritten letter I had sent to Donald my junior year of high school. I'd asked if he could get me a pair of tickets to a Rolling Stone concert. He couldn't. I kept to myself for the most part, but whenever I had a question, Ernie East, one of Donald's vice presidents and a very nice man, helped me out. He suggested documents that might be useful, and on occasion he'd put some file folders on my desk that he thought might help. The problem was that I didn't really know what the book was supposed to be about beyond its broad theme, which I cleverly deduced from its working title, The Art of the Comeback. I hadn't read either of Donald's other two books, but I knew a bit about them. The Art of the Deal, as far as I understood it, had been meant to present Donald as a serious real estate developer. The book's ghostwriter, Tony Schwartz, had done a good job, which he has long since regretted, of making his subject sound coherent, as if Donald had actually espoused a fully realized business philosophy that he understood and lived by. After the embarrassment of the poorly timed publication of Surviving at the Top, I assumed that Donald wanted to return to the relative seriousness of its predecessor. I set about trying to explain how, under the most adverse circumstances, he had emerged from the depths, victorious and more successful than he had ever been. There wasn't much evidence to support that narrative. He was about to experience his fourth bankruptcy filing with the Plaza Hotel, but I had to try. Every morning on the way to my desk, I stopped by to see Donald in the hope that he'd have time to sit down with me for an interview. I figured that would be the best way to figure out what he had done and how he had done it. His perspective was everything, and I needed the stories in his own words. He was usually on a call, which he'd put on speaker as soon as I sat down. The calls, as far as I could tell, were almost never about business. The person on the other end, who had no idea he or she was on speaker, was looking for gossip or for Donald's opinion about women or a new club that had opened. Sometimes he was being asked for a favor. Often the conversation was about golf. Whenever anything outrageously sycophantic, salacious, or stupid was said, Donald smirked and pointed to the speakerphone as if to say, "What an idiot." When he wasn't on a call, I'd find him going through the newspaper clippings that were collected for him daily. Every article was about him, or at least mentioned him. He showed them to me, something he did with most visitors. Depending on the content of the article, he sometimes wrote on it with a blue, flared felt tip marker, just like the one my grandfather used, and sent it back to the reporter. After he finished writing, he'd hold up the clipping and ask for my opinion of what he considered his witty remarks. That did not help me with my research. A few weeks after Donald hired me, I still hadn't gotten paid. When I brought it up to him, he pretended at first not to understand what I was talking about. I pointed out that I needed an advance so that I could at least buy a computer and a printer. I was still writing on the same electric typewriter I'd bought with Gam's help in grad school. He said he thought that was the publisher's problem. "Can you talk to Random House?" I didn't realize it at the time, but Donald's editor had no idea he'd hired me. One night, as I sat at home trying to figure out how to piece together something vaguely interesting out of the uninteresting documents I'd been poring over, Donald called. "When you come to the office tomorrow, Roan is going to have some pages for you. I've been working on material for the book. It's really good." He sounded excited. Finally, I might have something to work with, some idea about how to organize this thing. I still didn't know what he thought about his comeback, how he ran his business, or even what role he played in the deals he was currently developing. The next day, Rona handed me a manila envelope containing 10 typewritten pages as promised. I took it to my desk and began to read. When I finished, I wasn't sure what to think. It was clearly a transcript of a recording Donald had made, which explained its stream of consciousness quality. It was an aggrieved compendium of women he had expected to date, but who, having refused him, were suddenly the worst, ugliest, and fattest slobs he'd ever met. The biggest takeaways were that Madonna chewed gum in a way Donald found unattractive, and that Katharina Witt, a German Olympic figure skater who had won 2 gold medals and 4 world championships, had big calves. I stopped asking him for an interview. At that point, I would have stopped trying to be his niece. Anyway. All right, folks. Have fun out there.